Capacity Unlimited for 2 more months. I've enjoyed it. I'm sorry that it's coming to an end, actually. I love this board. I love what we do. And it's not that much work because everybody pitches in. Okay, one really, really good announcement. At the board meeting this morning, we decided that we can spend $8,000 for scholarships next year. It's thanks to you. You know, our membership dues are only $25 per person, $35 per family. So that doesn't make enough money for $8,000 worth of scholarships. What does that is extra donations that people make. And there are lots of you who have done that, and I hope lots of you continue to do it next year. It's those donations above and beyond your dues that enable us to give the $8,000 worth of scholarships. So, very exciting. And by the way, if you have been, most of your faces are familiar, but not all of them. If you have been visiting here as a guest 2 or 3 times, clearly you like us. So that doesn't mean Facebook. But perhaps you'd like us enough to join. It would really be appreciated if you would join and get sort of invested, $25 worth invested in the organization. And then who knows, you might help contribute to scholarships in the future. Now I know it's already March. We only have 2 more meetings this year. And so the dues will come due again in September. But if you join now, that would be just fine. We've had 3 people who've just joined in the last couple of weeks. So think about that. If you've been a guest, please join as soon as you can. And we just today recruited a new board member for next year. If there's anyone else who would like to be on the board, please see me after the meeting. As I say, it's a great group. There are a lot of us, so everybody does one little thing and it gets done very nicely. Let's see. Next month we have a lecture, but the following month is our luncheon lecture. And the lunch is going to be at the Sunbird. And today at the board meeting we had the very happy task of circling the 4 entrees that we should present to you on the menu. So it's a good thing we had goodies here to eat so that we weren't too hungry after doing that. Okay, after this meeting we're going to La Bella Vita, which is just west on Garden of the Gods Road, under the first bridge, turn left on North Park, it's right on that corner. La Bella Vita, very good Italian restaurant. And anybody who'd like to join us, please do. I'm going, probably 4, 5, 6 other people, maybe 10. So there's always room for more. Please do that. If you didn't notice, we have Pillar catalogs over there on the table. If you're not familiar with Pillar, take a catalog and take a look. They're sort of a sister organization to us in a way, in that they have lots and lots of lectures on lots and lots of topics. We have just a few lectures on lots and lots of topics. And they are going to be passing out our flyers at their sessions also, starting soon, and certainly next year a lot. So there may be some cross-pollination there, which will be fun. And okay, the next thing I need to do is introduce Bob Kate. Bob is a man of many talents. Bob is our luncheon kind of a coordinator man, and he's also a baker. So if you had any of the things over by the coffee pots, the cookies and the raisin bars, that's Bob. He really enjoys that. And next year, he will probably be president if you vote for him. And in addition, he's going to introduce our speaker for today. So Bob, where are you? Oh, you're right there.
Okay, last year we talked to our scholarship recipients committee, and one of the recipients last year said that the course called Ethical Leadership was one of her favorite classes, and that the professor Lisa Leberhardt was one of her favorite professors. So I sat in on a few of those classes of ethical leadership, very lively discussions. One of the textbooks for that class prompted me to ask Dr. Eberhardt to speak to us today on the topic of bad leadership. She's originally from New Hampshire. She divided her undergraduate studies between UC Boulder and here. She got her BA from UCCS, got her MA in Communications from UCCS in 2002. She was among the first group of UCCS graduate students to study in Siena, Italy, and in Vienna as part of the department's Intercultural Study Abroad grant. She got her PhD in Educational Leadership and Higher Education Administration in 2009 from the University of Nebraska. She began teaching part-time at UCCS as a teaching assistant in 2001. She's been teaching full-time since 2006. And this semester, she's teaching 6 courses. Business and Professional Communication, Organizational Leadership, Oral Communication in the Workplace, Ethical Leadership, Public Speaking, an honors class, and Gender and Leadership. So we're lucky that she has granted us some time here today. I think we're in for a neat experience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa.
Bob, I think you got out of the midterm, if I remember correctly. Okay. Well, I'm so glad to be here with you today. I want this to be interactive for us, so I'm hoping that we don't just wait till the end for questions. I hope you feel that you can ask questions at any time and you can talk and interact. This is a really neat topic, a little biased, but I think it's an important topic. And I think it's one that has a lot to do with a lot of things in current events. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think leadership, and especially ethical leadership and bad leadership, is something that we see in the news a lot. So as we talk about this complex topic, but important topic, if you have something that you want to say, something you want to comment on when I say something, please feel free to raise your hand or make a comment. And then we'll talk about it, because chances are someone else may have something that they're thinking about that they may want to say something about. And I may ask a question, and I may solicit some comments at any time. So, and we do have a couple of activities. So, I may ask you to get involved very purposefully. And, I mean, you're kind of in a classroom environment to some extent sometimes. Okay? You may have some work to do. Okay? So, as we open, as Bob said, I was asked to speak about this. This is Barbara Kellerman's book on bad leadership. And she is the James McGregor Burns professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And she's written this book about bad leadership, and we're going to talk about her perspective on this, as well as some other leadership scholars' perspective on bad leadership, how hers compares to their view on bad leadership. So as we begin, I want to open with a little video clip. It's going to take us back in time a little bit, but I want you to think about this clip, and I want you to think about leader accountability. Not just leader accountability, but follower accountability, because those are 2 things we're going to revisit as we go through this presentation today. And watch what's going on in this clip and think back to this time and what was going on at this time, because we're going to revisit this issue of accountability for behavior, responsibility for consequences in this issue, other issues we see in current events, and the importance of taking responsibility for actions. So let's look at this clip as we begin.
If each of you would stand.
The president of BP America may have taken responsibility today,
We will carry out our responsibilities.
but he wasn't about to take all the blame.
BP, as a leaseholder and the operator of the well, hired Transocean to drill that well.
That didn't sit well with the head of Transocean, who was seated just next to him. He signaled that the massive explosion may have stemmed from a mistake made by a subcontractor, Halliburton.
These events occurred after the well construction process was essentially complete.
The Halliburton executive sitting next to him pointed the finger back at BP.
Halliburton, as a service provider to the well owner, is contractually bound to comply with the well owner's instruction.
All three companies worked together on the doomed Deepwater Horizon. Oil giant BP hired Halliburton to seal the undersea well with cement in preparation for drilling, leasing the rig above it from Transocean, the world's largest offshore drilling company.
I hear one message, and the message is, don't blame me.
With some damage estimates now exceeding $10 billion, BP's head promised lawmakers he would pay all, quote, legitimate claims.
Okay, so if it's a legitimate claim, a harm to the fishing industry, you're gonna pay.
We're going to pay all legitimate claims.
If it's an impact or business loss from tourism, you're going to pay.
We're going to pay all legitimate claims.
To state and local governments for lost tax revenue, you're going to pay.
Question mark.
All three executives said they are aggressively investigating the cause of the disaster.
Was the well properly designed? Were there problems with the casing or the seal assembly?
But that wasn't good enough for some senators.
This sure fits, in my view, a pattern of serious safety and environmental problems at BP.
I'll acknowledge we've had issues and we've got to change some of the areas of the company.
The administration is calling for federal changes too. It wants to split the entity that oversees offshore drilling in half so that the part that collects huge royalties from oil companies then doesn't have to turn around and regulate them, Katie.
All right, Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill. Nancy, thank you.
You like that question mark? Okay. So you see this quote, refusing to face the dark side of leadership makes abuses more likely. This is Parker Palmer. He's an educational consultant and writer. We don't want to shy away from bad leadership. We want to seek to understand it. We want to understand that dark side in order to, what I like to call, lead in the light. And Craig Johnson, the author of one of the other textbooks I use in my ethical leadership class, says if we refuse to face that dark side, we are, more likely to fall to those abuses as well. So just as Kellerman and many others say, we need to understand bad leadership in order to, in order to avoid those ethical abuses. And we know we're going to talk about the relationship of power to leadership as well. So when you saw what was going on in this BP video, what does it remind you of the other things that we see in the news today?
It's not my fault.
It's not my fault. Excellent. Do we see any other current events that remind you of what went on at this time?
Affordable Care Act.
Affordable Care Act. Oh, that seems like a bone of contention I might have heard.
The missing plane.
The missing plane. Anybody pleading the fifth lately? Is anybody pleading the fifth? Bad leadership knows no party. Anybody pleading the fifth on either side? IRS. There's
New Jersey Bridge.
New Jersey Bridge. Those are excellent. Those are the two that were right at the top of my head. And it's so nice we're fair and balanced because that was one from each side, right? One from each side of the political party. So GM. Okay. Yeah, so people pleading the fifth. I don't know anything. Eventually we'll probably hear I was told to do it. So leader and followers, both leaders and followers failing to take responsibility.
This isn't on this particular episode, but I remember Obi Berra, catcher for the baseball team, said, "I didn't say what I said."
Okay, I didn't say what I said. That's great. I love it. Okay, so we're going to talk about, is it okay to say I just was doing what I was told? Is that okay?
Are those three men still in leadership positions at Halliburton, BP, and the other one today?
There's, I don't believe that I think that there's been a lot of change in leadership there, but that's an excellent question. I know the big person overseeing is not. That's correct, right? I mean, he kind of just basically said, no, I'm done. He was exhausted. Yeah, the BP, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he put his foot in his mouth several times before that was all done. Before that, and those, yeah. Okay. So let's look at what we are going to be talking about today. There's 5 major areas we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about good and versus bad leadership, and they're not really versus, but we're going to define what the 2 of those mean. You're going to help me do that today. What do those mean? Okay. And so in order to understand those, we kind of have to set them up, kind of understanding what they mean to each other, in relation to each other. We're going to look at the relationship of power and leadership, which there's a lot to be said about what they mean to one another as well. And then we're going to look at bad leadership types, and this relates directly to Kellerman, and profiling bad leaders. This also relates to Kellerman. And we're going to end by how do we maximize good leadership and minimize bad leadership. And if we do this right, we'll actually get through it all. How about that? And if we, have a lot of fun, that's even better. And if we, we may have to talk about our conclusion. Oh, my laser doesn't work on that. But we'll draw our conclusions at the end and hopefully create some optimism for the future. Because when I say maximizing good leadership, this is difficult. In our climate, in our leadership climate, and what I say is a crisis of leadership right now, it's difficult to talk about maximizing good leadership, I think. But we'll see what you have to say too, because I think that it's important to talk about this together, because we own the future together. Okay? So this is where you have some work to do. Okay? And my assistant is my husband, who I've called upon to help me get some things distributed, and I'll do some work too. But we're going to hand out some sheets, and what I would like for you to do is, you want me to help?
I can help.
Okay, you sure? Wow, okay. Assistance, thank you. We probably have enough for everyone. I was going to say work in pairs, and you're welcome to collaborate, but we may have enough sheets for everyone. I have 40 sheets, so we'll see how many people are here. If there aren't, please collaborate. This was meant to be a collaborative exercise. So you are welcome to work in pairs, but I would like you to come up with 5 extraordinary leaders. And yes. They do not have to be living. That's an excellent question. But the word extraordinary, you define what that means to you. But these need to be of historic significance. So they need to be someone that everybody would know. So they do not have to be living, but of some kind of historic significance. Can be political, can be organizational, can be from some institution, male, female, any leader of historic significance that you feel is extraordinary in any way.
But I need a pencil.
Yeah, we've got all kinds of pencils if you need them. Thank you. And take a few minutes. Yeah. And then when you're done, we'll give you a few minutes when you're done, and I'd like you to be willing to share some of your lists. And my lovely assistant will write some on the board. How's that? I did tell him I'd be putting him to work, so. And I don't pay very well. Okay, do any of you want to share your list? Okay, we have someone.
Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs.
Mandela.
Mandela.
Yeltsin, thank you. I couldn't remember his first name. Was it Churchill?
Churchill?
Gandhi?
Gandhi.
Harry Truman?
Gandhi and Truman.
John Paul II.
Truman.
Merkel? Angela Merkel.
Nice. Merkel. K. Just K, I think.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Theodore Roosevelt.
What's Dalai Lama?
Jesus Christ?
George Washington.
Oh, yeah.
Obama.
Obama. Thatcher, I heard.
President Obama.
Colin Powell. Sam Shockley.
Yeah. Shockley.
In industry, David Packard.
Yeah.
L.E.Y.
Yeah, I knew something was that. And then,
John Elway. Reagan.
We need more women. Eleanor Roosevelt.
Go to Mayor, please.
yeah.
Colin Powell.
Hitler.
David Packard. David Packard. Henry Ford.
Ford.
Margaret Thatcher.
We have her up at the top.
I'd say Jesus.
Oh, yeah, Jesus is up there.
Jefferson.
Another bad one is Jones of the Jonestown Massacre. James Jones.
Just extraordinary, so whatever you feel is extraordinary.
Cory Booker. Cory Booker.
Jack Welch. Mother Teresa.
Disney.
Leonard Bernstein.
Pope Francis.
Queen Elizabeth.
Nice. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, I love that, a couple of things. Love that somebody threw out, we gotta have more women on there because I teach gender and leadership. And I also love that somebody said, do we want to have, some bad people up there? I love that somebody said that because I let you define extraordinary by yourselves and whatever that meant in terms of leadership. And that moves us into our next area, which is talking about good versus bad leadership and defining what that means. Because a couple of people on there may have been extraordinary, but now we need to talk about what that means to the leadership experts. Okay? And this sets up some controversy for us. And you got us started with your great list. So let's talk about that. I mentioned that Barbara Kellerman was the James McGregor Burns Professor at Harvard, which is really interesting because she disagrees with James McGregor Burns. And it sets up basically the entire premise of her book, her disagreement with Burns. And that's why she calls bad leadership, bad leadership. And so let's start out by talking about where Burns stands. Burns is basically, I like to call him Granddaddy Burns, because he is the grandfather of modern leadership studies. And as we look at the evolution of leadership theory, it kind of evolves through the 20th century from what we call the great man theories. And that is at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a kind of a belief in this born versus made kind of discussion. And there was a belief that leaders were born. And that was that leaders were mostly men. They were born men. And they were born of a certain class. And they were born into privilege. And they were born with a pathway to leadership set out. And if you weren't born of a certain gender, if you weren't born of a certain class, if you weren't born great men, then you really had no access to leadership. And so that was the argument, that leaders were born. They weren't made. And as leadership research evolved, it was evolved into trait theories, it was evolved into situational theories, it was evolved into functional theories, and it was evolved into relational theories. And this isn't a lecture on leadership theory, so we won't go into all of that because that is an entirely different lecture. And it could be an entirely different semester. Okay, because it is an entire class. But it evolved, and the understanding of leadership evolved. But Burns wrote a landmark book called Leadership in the late 70s, 1978. And he challenged that notion, and it was at a time of leadership crisis. And he talks about the fact that at this time, he no longer accepted the idea that leaders could treat followers as objects. And he said leaders had to serve a higher purpose for followers. And he used this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How many of you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Okay. So he said leaders who met lower level needs of safety, belonging, love, well, not love at work, but those lower basic needs for followers. And he looked at what was going on in most jobs where there were assembly line workers and people went to work with the hope of, getting a paycheck and doing basically the same thing every day. And those lower level needs, he called that transactional leadership. And there was nothing really wrong with it, but it didn't serve a higher purpose for followers. Followers were not really becoming empowered. They were not having their self-esteem met necessarily, and they certainly weren't meeting those higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy where they were reaching self-actualization, which is the top level. So he said leaders that met those higher levels were transformational leaders. And they sought to see followers reach all their goals. And so leaders who did that were truly transformational leaders, and then those followers became leaders in their own right. And that's what leaders were meant to do. Leaders are meant to help all followers reach their goals and become leaders themselves. And leaders who are not transformational and simply transactional were not reaching their true leadership potential. And he went even further than that. He said that leaders who obliterated their followers were not leaders at all. They do not deserve the title because leadership is reverent. It's truly reverent. In a time of leadership crisis, let's hold leaders accountable and responsible. And if they are obliterating their followers, let's not even call them that. Let's call them what they truly are. They are power wielders. They're hungry for power. They're abusing their power. They're merely power wielders. So, he took a very strong, hard stance in the late 70s on this. And it was revolutionary. So now we move from all these leadership theories, from traits, functional, situational, functional, relational, to transformational. And this is the theory that holds true today. We've had servant leadership, we've had authentic leadership. These are all offshoots of transformational leadership theory. It is still premier today. So, we're Burnsian, and I am Burnsian. I am, I adhere to Burns. And so does Keller. She's a Burns professor. She's a Burns fellow. If we're in the age of Burns, what do we say about some of these people? Can we even call them leaders? No. In hindsight. Okay, hold that thought. Hold that thought. Okay, let's move to Kellerman. Kellerman, again at Harvard, she says, in answer to Burns, that those who have that warm, fuzzy, positive view of leadership's not necessarily good. She said this modern slant on leadership, to say that leadership is by de facto good, are fooling ourselves. That to look at leadership through this lens is like studying health while ignoring disease. Okay? And she uses yours truly as her prime example. And she calls this phenomenon Hitler's ghost. Because she says, arguably, no one had a greater impact on 20th century leadership, and yes, she calls it leadership, than Hitler. And she says not to call what Hitler did leadership is semantically irresponsible. Because she said he was brilliantly skilled. He inspired. He mobilized his followers. Yes, he used coercion, but coercion and the use of power in leadership is nothing new. We'll talk about that in a minute. He said, she said, if this is not leadership, what is? now it's bad leadership. Hence her book, Bad Leadership. We need to call it what it is. So she felt like we needed to make the distinction that it's bad leadership. Now Burns made a distinction too. He called it power wielding. And he had lesser leadership, kind of like transactional. But she said we need to recognize that leadership is not always good. Leadership by default is not good. It never has been. There's always been bad leadership. And we'll talk a little bit about one other person she used as a stellar example. And she said that semantically it's irresponsible in the language. It's difficult to say someone like Hitler, no, he's not a leader. We can't call him a leader. We need to call him a power wielder. She said we need to call these people leaders. We just need to have categories for them. And we need to discuss them as they are in their own right and categorize them according to their failed leadership. So I'm going to put it out there to you. What do you think?
So would he be then called failed leaders?
We're going to talk about what they would be called. We're going to talk about these bad leader types that Kellerman has come up with. You're going to be typing some leaders as well. But what do you think about this? Do you think Burns is right, that leadership is something reverent, and those who grossly fail, Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin, do you think that they've lost the right to be called leaders at all? Or do you think that it still is leadership?
They earned the right to be called bad leaders.
Okay.
But not earned the right. You can't give up the fact that they were leaders. They just were bad leaders.
But even today, excuse me.
Yeah, here than here.
Even today, you can find people in Germany who lived during that time who will say, yes, he was a bad leader because of bad results, end results, but he did some good at the same time. And they cite some economic things that happened in Germany at the time. So was he both good on one hand and bad on the other? Question.
Right. Similar to some of these things and some of the progress. And okay, excellent point. Here and then here.
I have a problem with the power wielder idea because there are many, many people who wield power who are not leaders and behind the scenes power people. So I think the leadership aspect comes in where it says here, skilled at inspiring, mobilizing, and directing followers. That's a leader.
So you think that maybe it's just him in terms of that he might be a bad leader, but do you think there are others that may be power wielders and not leaders if we didn't use just Hitler as an example?
Well, yes. I'm just saying that it's too broad a definition to call a power wielder a leader.
Okay, because when we talk about the relationship with power and leadership, there, we'll get there in a minute, but maybe I need to jump the gun because you make such a good point. It's possible to have power without leadership. It's not possible to have leadership without power. So that's, in terms of Burns, Hitler may not be the right example, but there may be power wielding absent of leadership.
So perhaps we need to define power. Because
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of Gandhi,
Uh-huh.
who was certainly a great leader. But I've never really envisioned Gandhi as having the kind of power, for instance, that Hitler had. So what would be the definition?
Well, leadership is an influence process. And so you must have power to have leadership. So influence. Okay. Here we had a comment in the back here.
There's an interesting feature of leadership. It has nothing to do with morality. If you want to simply define what leadership is, not its outcome.
Okay, interesting. See, Burns would say there needs to be that ethical component, that moral component, because his is transformational. But you know, Kellerman would agree, leadership is not necessarily ethical. Leadership is coercion. Leadership has the coercion, and always has. And it may be bad, it may be good. It just is. She does not necessarily see that ethical component. It has been there, you know, and I'll talk just in a minute of who she talks about as well. And you'll all say, oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here, then we have a comment here. Did I just do that? Does that mean?
An older term that I heard, I think is from the 1800s, is called unrighteous dominion.
Okay, so you're going to like who I bring up in a minute. Okay, back here, then here.
You said a very important word in the beginning, and that is follower accountability. And I hope we get into some discussion about that.
We are, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up. Yes?
I was wondering what Burns meant by obliterating followers.
Yes. Well, in terms of, if we're talking about Hitler, absolute discounting of followers. So in hindsight, looking at the fact, did Hitler, we're talking about, you know, motivating, directing, inspiring, mobilizing followers. That would be looking at it in terms of what he did at the time. If you look at hindsight, would you say that Hitler had the best interests of followers in mind if you look hindsight? Never. But at the time, I'm sure that people were thinking that he had the best interests of Germany, the best interests of the Third Reich, all this at heart. But in hindsight, did he leave them behind? Did he leave them better than he found them? Then no, in hindsight. So, you know, in hindsight, judgment changes. So in hindsight, you think that there was an obliteration of followers. In hindsight, you think that the power was for him, was you know, self-serving. So, you know, the judgment of the leader in terms of intention, when you look holistically, and when Kellerman profiles leaders, one of the profile categories we're going to talk about is called hindsight, and judging the leader in hindsight with that perspective.
I guess what I was wondering was military leaders, like General Patton, for instance.
Excellent example.
Because he certainly obliterated his followers.
Yes, that's such a great example. And yet, you know, when we talk about Kellerman as well, we're going to talk about effective versus ethical. And so we're doing all this before I get there, but it's because you guys are so good. You're so good. Because I'm going ahead of myself, but you think, would I rather serve someone who is ethical or effective, you know, versus the flip? And Patton's such a great example. Okay, and then here.
Just one more note about Mr. Schicklgruber. He's an ideologue, as many of the names on that board. And he didn't abandon those who joined him as the Aryan nation. He just lost the war, and they were all obliterated, power or possession or life. Now, the only people he obliterated are those who disagreed with him or he thought were inferior. So this guy doesn't fit a lot of the comments that are being made about obliteration. He did not. Germany at the time was the most Christian nation in the world. And they joined as an Aryan nation. He came up with another ideology that made them superior to everyone else. And those who were inferior, he darn sure did obliterate.
Focused
and it's
obliteration.
Like Nelson Mandela. He was in jail because he was a communist and a terrorist.
So he would not have considered those he obliterated followers at a time.
Right.
The obliteration
Now,
occurred.
Nelson Mandela in jail changed his whole life thoughts and became the hero that he deserved to be. because he fought
Right.
a much greater cause upon contemplation that terrorism and communism wasn't going to work for him.
Yes, again, so his judgment, our judgment of him is
So
hindsight as
it's
well,
your point
holistic.
of view.
It's the
There's
whole.
still a lot of people in Germany who don't think Hitler had the wrong idea, he just didn't win.
Good point, good point. Okay, here, we'll have our last comment and then we'll keep moving forward. So I told you we were gonna have fun and we gotta keep on time. Hi.
You offered a segue when you mentioned ethics.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes you have to look at, you can isolate your perspective or you can look at the broad picture and you have to know what the mission is. And if the bad leader is adhering to the mission of the greater organization, then bad in Burns' perspective, are they really a bad leader? They're doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Based on the mission.
Excellent point. Yeah. And so, I don't always see that Burns and Kellerman are mutually exclusive because I see them both recognizing bad leadership. I do see it somewhat an argument of semantics. That they're arguing semantics to a large extent. But we've talked, we kind of got into this argument this discussion of the relationship of power. And we already talked about this thought that power can exist without leadership, but leadership does need dimensions of power because power is about influence. And leadership always has an element of influence and power behind it. So we know this popular quote about the idea of power corrupting and unfettered power corrupting. Absolutely, this quote is so popular. Everyone knows it. But I promised you, and my laser does not work on that, so I can't even laser it for you, but Kellerman has never seen a problem with separating coercion and power from leadership because she sees it as a given. And it's largely due to this guy, Machiavelli. So what did Machiavelli have to say about it? Yeah, his counsel to princes. He has basically saying that it's a given and that the only bad leader was the weak leader. Coercion, manipulation, that was a given in leadership.
And the end justifies the means.
The end justifies the means. Yeah, so this notion of to be a leader is to be good is relatively new, is what Kellerman argues. And she talks about, Machiavellian leadership and that being a given, that coercion is part of leadership. So leadership is good and leadership is bad. She says to understand the bad is to keep from stepping in the bad, stepping in the darkness, and being able to, again, maximize the good. We need to understand the pitfalls so that we can lead in the light and lead in the good. So that's basically what, those two sides are and what we want to kind of understand as we move into that. Now, Rosebeth Moss Cantor, also from Harvard, talks about how we're uncomfortable with the discussion of power. And she says that it's America's last dirty word, okay? We don't like to talk about it because it has a negative connotation, okay? So those who have it don't really want to openly discuss the fact that they have it. They don't want to put it in anybody's face that they've got it. And those who don't have it don't want to appear that they've got too much. And if they're planning to get it, they don't want to openly discuss their plans to get it. Because that would seem, that they're, power hungry. So it's easier to talk about money, it's easier to talk about sex. Power is difficult. Okay, and so it's interesting that Burns chose the word power wielding as his negative, connotation for those who are, those who have obliterated followers, which obliterates a pretty strong word too, if we're talking semantics. And as a communication scholar, I see the power in words, right? Okay, so do you think this is true? You think power is a dirty word?
It's a dirty word on one side, if it's broadcast.
Keep it
But
to
if it's-
yourself?
But if it's within,
So your personal power is all good, just don't tell me about it? Don't broadcast it.
It reminds me of the word humility.
Humility.
Yeah, as soon as you say you have it, you don't.
That's, now we're talking about virtue ethics. We're getting to some ancient ethics now, your virtue ethics. All right, let's be humble about it, yes.
I think it's more brinkmanship, because if you're in a group of other sharks, you don't want to talk about being the one who needs the only shark left over.
Oh, nice. Absolutely, okay. Yeah.
I can't quote their names, but I think that the few women who have risen to the top recently, one who I believe delivered a baby a couple weeks after she the IBM.
Oh, no, yeah, is she Yahoo? Or, no, you're talking about Marissa Meyer. Is she at Yahoo?
Those women
Yes.
seem more free in discussing their home life, their power as the leader of that corporation, what pregnancy would do to that.
Yeah,
what
first
the
CEO to have her
difficulties
have a baby.
are, than men do. I think men, they will just assume the position and the family can take what it gets. But these women seem to be much more open and they go on talk shows and they go on women's talk shows and they discuss their problems.
Yeah, much tougher for women, I think, to broadcast their power. Much tougher dance with that.
Well, don't you think it's not okay for women in this culture to have power? I mean, it's still kind of is seen as, they can wield power as long as they don't appear to wield power.
Yeah, they have a much more, now it's a totally different talk. Remember, gender and leadership, math class. Yeah, women have, women who broadcast their power are judged much differently. But it's just really fascinating because there's a term called bully broads. And so when women wield their power, they have to, they have to do it carefully. Because they're either seen as maternal, when they're seen as maternal, they can be seen as maternal or they can be seen as, less. When they take a supervisory position. They have a tough time. Look, I don't know what kind of response I'm going to get, but Hillary Clinton knows that dance very well because she's assumed different positions. And you've seen how it's played out in the media. Regardless of how you feel about her personally, she's been in the spotlight for a long time in many different roles.
Well, the power brokers today have learned a lot through academia, how to change the subject and how to misdirect. And you use Hillary's, well, she and Bill have been involved in more illegal activities than any two people have ever been, and that says a lot, including Grant's government. But they have managed to, through the exercise of power and influence and paying off the right friends and getting rid of the bad ones, and change the subject, and they constantly do it.
And that never happens in politics.
Oh, no, I'm saying politics has learned how to use that as experts.
Well,
they have whole staffs.
We're going to talk about politics and democracy as we kind of conclude. Not that we're getting ready to conclude, but when we conclude, that's what I want to talk about with you, is what your thoughts are on democracy as we look to the future and our optimism for accountability, because we can't talk about accountability and not talk about politics. It just wouldn't be fair, would it? So you hold that thought. And we had a hand here, and then we'll go here.
Well, I was going to say that a lot of those things that were negative, I agree with. Yet when you look at the era they were in power, there was more prosperity for everybody. So to me, that's what makes them a plus. It wasn't just the rich getting richer, everybody.
Yeah, we had a Republican Congress that gave them all the ideas and passed them. cooperated with the Congress, and they got lots of things done for the betterment of America. And he got the credit. Well, so what? He did the job.
All right. Wow, everybody's getting along. Can't we just get along? That's great. I like this group.
I was going to say that I think that power, the negative feeling of power in this country may have to do with our unique history. Because we were founded on an idea of individual freedom and individual power. Some think that we've gone too far with our individualism versus our sense of community. But nonetheless, we have almost a built-in feeling that of empowerment of the individual. So we don't like to think that other people have power over us. So that becomes a negative feeling and a negative word.
Excellent. That's so important to remember. We don't like that. And that has a lot to do, I think, exactly like you said, with that connotation. Because feeling powerless is such an uncomfortable thing. Okay, so let's talk about, we already brought this up, and I'm just going to move forward on these rather than clicking them one at a time so you can see them. There's a cheat sheet on the back of your extraordinary leader list. So you can be peeking at this as we go through this. We already talked about how Kellerman broke down a couple of different areas. She said leaders can be ineffective, they can be unethical. And I kind of posed the question, would you rather serve someone who was ineffective and ethical? Or would you rather serve someone who was unethical but effective? No thank you? That's all I got is no thank you. Blanket statement. Ethical would be somebody who makes the right moral choices when faced with, with a dilemma. And dilemmas can be unclear, but when there's a clear ethical choice, would make the right choices, or one that you think is the best choice in an ethical dilemma. I mean, there are ones where there is a clear ethical choice, and there are those where there's just the best choice, and weighs those ethical choices and makes a top, clearly better choice. And then effective versus ineffective, somebody who makes a clearly more strategic, effective choice in your estimation.
Who defines ethical choices?
Excellent. Well, in a case of
What was your comment?
Who defines ethical choices?
in the case of an ethical lapse, we're talking Enron. That would be clearly ethical or unethical. So there is a breach of law. In the case of an ethical dilemma, it would be you're faced with a no-win situation. And in that case, it would be something where a majority would consider that a better choice. Because in a dilemma, there is no clear right or wrong. It's just something where a majority of people would consider this a better choice, like a utilitarian approach. And in a utilitarian approach, you're considering what is the best for the majority. So that would be like a layoff because it's in the best interest of the company. Yes, there are some people that are going to be hurt, but it's clearly the best. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes?
I saw a program on the building of the Grand Coulee Dam. And of course, it was the most, at that time, amazing engineering feat that anybody had ever heard of. But it displaced, I don't know the number, but many Native American Indians. It displaced a lot of people who chose to live in that wilderness area and got their own living from the streams that were running as they were. But yet, when I look at what that Grand Coulee Dam has done for what we like to call our civilized commercial country, it watered the vegetable land that gives us all fresh vegetables. It did hydroelectric projects. So when I watched it, I was crying when I saw the Indians who regretted that perhaps some of the burial grounds had been put underwater.
It's 11 o'clock.
That's my computer, sorry.
And then I made myself a salad for lunch, and I wondered where all those vegetables had come from. So it's a very hard choice for ordinary people.
So you as the follower might determine that was effective, but was it ethical?
Yeah, it's a question. You don't think about it until it faces you on the screen and asks you those questions.
Exactly.
You accept that it was progress.
Exactly. And progress is very difficult.
But at what price?
Progress is difficult for that absolute reason.
About the oil pipeline.
Yeah. Same thing.
Controversy right now.
Absolutely. It's such a difficult question. And it's so easy to say, I don't want it because of that, but then we all drive our cars every day. Those are the difficult questions. So those are the questions we ask ourselves, though. You know, which leader? I mean, these are excellent questions, and these are soul-searching questions. These are the the 7 types that Kellerman breaks it down. We've talked about how Kellerman talks about bad leadership and understanding bad leadership. And when she talks about bad leaders, such as Hitler, she would say, he's a leader. We're not going to say he's not a leader, but he's a bad leader. And she would put him down here, under evil. And if my laser worked, I could circle it for you, but it's down there on evil. Yes?
When you look at Putin, there's a lot of people in Russia who think he's a great leader, and there's us who don't think he is.
Okay, don't say anymore. Don't say anymore, we're gonna get there. Hold that thought, because that's part of our job that's coming right up, because you're gonna be typing leaders, and he's one I picked. Okay, so hold that thought, okay? So these are your types, and you've got your cheat sheet, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this so we have time to do our activity. But incompetent is that you lack skill or will. So you basically, this leader would be incompetent. Rigid would be this leader is basically unwilling to change or adapt to the situation that calls for that adoption? Yeah. Adaptation?
Adaptation.
Thank you. What was that? More coffee is needed. Okay, intemperate would be the leader who is undisciplined. Okay, so lacks self-control. Maybe you can, I'm not going to give leader examples yet because we're going to be doing that in just a minute. But I know are you thinking of one?
No, but these are not qualities of leadership. They are qualities of people you wouldn't want to have working for you.
These are all, well, these...
I mean, it's broad brushed, so to define it only as leadership, I think is missing the point.
Well, these...
As an employer, you would not want to have people working for you who had these particular characteristics.
Well, Kellerman talks about that these can be leaders and these can be followers as well. And she does talk about that. Somebody said, I hope we're going to talk about followers as well and follower responsibility, and we're going to get into that on the next slide. But these are, you can think of so many leaders who have these traits as you look at these, and we're going to profile some in just a minute. But absolutely, we have followers with these same problems and symptoms. And so many times followers mirror the leader. And many times leaders are attracted to followers who are like them when they hire their networks. So that's an excellent point. You've got your callous leader and subsequently followers. Just uncaring, thoughtless, unkind, doesn't take the needs of the followers into account in decision-making processes. We have corrupt leaders willing to do criminal acts, lies, cheats, steals, so commits fraud, things like that. Insular leaders, withdrawn from groups under their, who they have responsibility over. So maybe they designate certain followers, certain groups that they interact with, and then others become part of outgroups, and they become insular. And so have you ever been part of an organization where you felt that you had no access to your leader? And that's extremely frustrating. We have then your evil leaders. These are your leaders that are willing to commit atrocities, use pain as an instrument of power against children, against, any population at all. I think this is not a leader I've profiled, so I'll throw this out, but I think of Coney and the things that Coney has done to gain power by getting children in his army. Joseph Kony, many of you know Joseph Kony? Yeah, it was in Syria as well. But Joseph Kony, if you go on YouTube, there's a video about Kony. But he is absolutely the definition of evil. He's got this thing called the Lord's Army, and he recruits children to fight for him. And he gets children, takes children from their family, gets the children to murder their parents in many cases, and then basically systematically breaks the children down until they're nothing but killing machines. Okay, so let's go through the profile system that Kellerman uses, and then we're going to profile some leaders. Kellerman breaks the leader down in a way that you can better understand the leader. And by doing this, she has 6 areas that she looks at. And the first is the prologue, and this is the introductory stage of the leader. When the leader starts leading, how many leaders start out and say, I'm going to be a bad leader? I just want to really screw this up. I'm planning to just mess this up big time, and that's my objective. Leaders don't start out this way. So this is looking at what's going on at the beginning of the leader's role and that introductory stage of what's, as they enter their organization, politics, what's that initial role that they have, and what's that kind of, introductory stage, what's going on, what may be the factors that begin that fall or decline. The context is the setting. What time, what place, what environment the leader is leading in that may influence what happens, again, to cause that decline. And then the leader themselves. What kind of personal background, their family, their upbringing, what's going on with the leader themselves. And this is also where you explore the leader type. Which one of those 7 types is attributable to the leader? The followers, somebody said, are we going to talk about the followers? The followers are, Kellerman stresses that the followers are pretty much almost equally responsible for what's going on with the leader, because followers have a great responsibility and a great role. Why do bad followers exist? Well, they exist because they refuse to be good followers. Followers have an obligation to speak up, to be accountable as well. And they are part of the problem. They are a huge part of the problem. And there's a quote that we're going to talk about at the end, and that is, when followers do not speak up and do not refuse to do bad things, do not refuse to be accountable as well, do not refuse to hold bad leaders accountable, they become a huge part of the problem. So we want to examine the followers when we look at the problem. They are responsible, and many times they mirror the bad leadership, and then they exacerbate it. So we want to consider the followers greatly. The web is looking at this tangled network. Yes?
I'm sorry, we have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, all right. Oh, that's it? Oh, I thought we went till 11:30.
No.
Oh.
Sorry, when people have, there's a bus that leaves at 11:20.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, and then the last is looking in hindsight at the perspective that you have from the end and being able to judge the leadership with that benefit of perspective that we talked about. Being able to look from the hindsight of the situation with that perspective of a holistic view. So this is the profile that Kellerman uses to look at the leader, as we said. As we were talking about Hitler before, seeing everything from the benefit of hindsight. So we were going to poll these leaders, and you were going to get to use your cell phones and vote, and we were going to determine which ones. So Putin, someone was saying Putin, and what Kellerman felt like Putin was rigid, and she used the example of the submarine incident where he let those 118 men die and refused to call for help. Now, that was not in today's context. Putin, she did not have the benefit when she wrote the book of knowing what was going on with Putin today. She did use the example of what was going on back when he refused to call for help when all those men were in the submarine. So that was interesting. But let's look at our conclusion really quick. What I wanted to say about my optimism for the future is that, again, I feel that just as we saw in the BP video, leader and follower accountability is key. And in this quote, leadership cannot be stopped or slowed unless followers in collective effort with leaders take responsibility and are accountable. But we must reward our good leaders. We have to recognize our good leaders and reward them. And on the flip side, we need to hold the bad leaders responsible. And we need to hold them accountable. We need more transparency. But what I'm asking you is, how is it possible? And is it possible to make that happen when we have is it possible to have true democracy when we have such a vast difference in resources? And there's no easy answer to that. I'm not proposing there's any easy answer to that. But Oxfam released the statistic that 85 of the world's richest people have as much wealth as about half of the world. And that just came out in January of this year. Power is centralized. Right now, decision-making power is very centralized in some very wealthy people. And it's not going to change anytime soon. In fact, it's probably going to continue to be exacerbated because that power doesn't change once it's there. So is it possible for accountability and leadership if that is the picture? There's no easy answers, but there's hope because there's a lot of people who care. And there's a lot of people who desire good leadership. So that's just the challenge I think we have facing us, is not standing for bad leadership, continuing to desire good leadership, and continuing to speak out. Any comments?
Are any of those people on that board? 85 folks.
Any of those people?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think there's anybody on there. Yes.
How many of these 85 are true leaders, or how many have just inherited that?
There's a lot of people that have inherited it. There's a lot of people that it's been in the family a long time. And that's why I say it's not going to change anytime soon, because once that wealth is centralized, it doesn't go anywhere. That's a good question.
And a lot of that number are not Western civilization, and they hold their wealth because of what they've gotten out of the ground or somewhere else, and who would fit evil very well as ideologues, whether it's religious or what.
Right, and when they have that wealth, they have decision-making power. I mean, they buy government. I mean, I hate to say that, but that's why I was saying we can't have this discussion without talking about government and politics. You know, is democracy possible? Because then that is government truly free? Is democracy truly free? And I apologize, I was thinking we had Q&A from 11:15 to 11:30. That's my fault. I misunderstood that. So I apologize for that. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. You were wonderful. I appreciate it so much. Yes.
I'll make this short.
Okay.
When I graduated from an all-men technical university, the speaker said, "All right, you guys, you're pretty darn smart. I know you already got your jobs. But the next thing is, you better be darn sure who it is that you marry. Because that good-looking gal and so forth, if you have a divorce, you have kids, and all that sort of thing, you're not going to have a happy career. And your third responsibility is the history of the world is one of kings dictators, despots, and all that sort of thing. The big experiment is democracy. That's your responsibility to make sure that democracy survives.
Excellent. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Thank you.
Yes.